Hello and welcome to the Joe Cannon Health Podcast. I am Joe Cannon and today it is episode number 13. If this is your first time listening, welcome. I want you to know that I do post new episodes every week, same bat time, same bat channel, which for me is every Friday morning. So you can expect to have new episodes every Friday morning, hopefully by the time you wake up. Before I went live with this, I wanted to get an idea of where my show is showing up, and it's pretty much everywhere now. If you're listening probably on Apple Podcasts, that's where most people tend to listen to things, all things podcasts. So I am there, but I'm also on Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Republic Radio, various Android apps, Stitcher, Spotify, a whole bunch of places. So you should not have any problem hearing this show. If you do and you can't find it anywhere, do drop me an email and I will submit the podcast to where you need me to submit it to. But it should be pretty much everywhere now. But there's a whole bunch of podcasting apps out there, and usually they all grab from the same place. But if there's anyone out there you want me to submit this podcast feed to, let me know, and I will definitely do that. Now, before I went live recording this episode today, I checked Apple Podcasts and I had another 5-star review. Thank you very much. I do appreciate it. This one came from Truth Seeker 3547. Who says always great information. This Truth Seeker apparently has, he or she has been to some of my classes in the past. I was introduced to Joe through AAAI ISMA. That is a fitness organization that I speak to and lecture to. I train personal trainers, and that's the organization I work with. Having certifications through them, I've gone through many classes taught by Joe. I always appreciate his research and expertise on the topic. Thank you. Whenever I have to take a class of recertification, I look to see if he's teaching and will sign up for his classes. Thank you very much. It's always great to see. It's great to see how he's now doing a podcast, sharing all the great information I've heard him teach over the years. And if you want, basically ends up saying, if you want an honest opinion on the topic of health and fitness backed by research, make sure you subscribe to this podcast. Hey, I couldn't have said that better myself, Truth Seeker. So I really appreciate your words. Now, again, if you're just tuning in for the first time, in case you don't know me, and I'm sure most people don't know me, and that's fine. I have a degree in exercise science and undergrad in biochemistry. I do train and certify personal trainers. I conducted almost 1,000 fitness certifications over the years. And in my world of fitness and health, I tend to focus mostly on people who have different health issues, arthritis, diabetes, fibromyalgia, etc. And I also do a lot of study on the topic of dietary supplements. I have an entire website devoted to nothing but honest reviews of dietary supplements, and those you can find at supplementclarity.com. And then the other area that I tend to focus an awful lot on is exercise-induced rhabdomyolysis, which is actually the topic of today's episode. We're going to talk about something a little different than I have ever talked about before. The genetic causes of rhabdo. Are there any traits, some genetic traits that can raise someone's risk of getting rhabdomyolysis, which is a very serious medical disorder? Now, before we get into the genetic traits of rhabdomyolysis, I do like to start off these episodes by covering a health and fitness myth of the week. And this myth today is a weight loss myth, and it basically goes like this. If you're trying to lose weight, do you have to cleanse or detox your colon to do it? Well, no, you don't. And this myth has been around an awful long time. We've probably all seen TV commercials and various ads on social media, even by influencers, and I'm using air quotes when I call them influencers, who talk about various dietary supplements and protocols to help clean out and detoxify the colon. There really obviously is not any evidence that you're going to lose any meaningful weight by doing any of these protocols or supplements, etc. And one thing I like to point out when I watch the commercials and online, etc. for these products is they usually talk about how the products will remove toxins from the body. Have you ever noticed, however, that they never tell you what the toxins are? Are we talking a bacteria? Are we talking viruses? What are these toxins? I honestly think they keep it vague, because if they actually did say it removed the bacteria, well, we could actually do some research then, and we can find out if that product or the ingredients in that product had any clinical research that it removed that particular thing. So I think they keep the idea of toxins vague on purpose, but that's, again, a story for another time. But, when I see toxins, it's a little bit of a red flag for me. And also, again, when we talk detox, you often see the word cleanse used in conjunction with the word detox. Cleanse, as I've been saying for years, cleanse really means laxative. And the reason I think they, use the word cleanse now is it's a sexy new name. Laxatives are kind of boring in a way. But when I look at the ingredients in a lot of these detox cleanse supplements, what do I see? Fiber. And we all know that fiber makes people go to the bathroom. And so that's why I tend to call these cleanse products laxatives for the most part. And another tip-off, for instance, that they are indeed laxatives mostly, is that many of these detox cleanse products will contain an herbal ingredient called senna. Senna is an herbal product which actually will make you go to the bathroom. It is a laxative. As a matter of fact, you can buy senna-based laxatives in supermarkets and drugstores and stuff like that, which again is another tip-off that these things really work as laxatives. And the same thing goes for the teas that you may have seen online, which claim to cleanse your colon and detox you. Again, what do I see when I look at some of these detox teas? Well, senna. And senna, again, it works on the large intestine, and it makes the large intestine spastic, if you will, which in turn makes us go to the bathroom more. And also, tea is hot, usually consumed hot, and many times hot beverages can make you want to go to the bathroom. So what you're really losing here is essentially fecal matter, poop. There, I said it, poop. I always wanted to say poop on a podcast. And also a lot of water. And again, no meaningful weight loss. And another reason why I say this is true is that, these cleanse supplements, they really only work at the large intestine, the colon. Well, if you remember back from, say, anatomy class we may have taken in high school or college or whatever, the human body has two different intestines. We've got a small intestine and a large intestine. The small intestine is where we are absorbing the food. We're absorbing nutrients in this small intestine. The large intestine is where we basically store the stuff that's left over. The poo. And so when people take a lot of these cleanse supplements, they really only work at the large intestine, the colon, and that's why you're mostly losing fecal matter and water. There's really no meaningful fat loss coming from these products. And so that's why I tend to group them in as a whole as a big old myth. And also, while we're on the topic, I want people to realize that, the human body is pretty good at detoxing itself. We've got livers and kidneys that help us do all these things. Exercise, movement, activity is also very good at helping us cleanse the body. Again, notice that you may have noticed that after exercise, after a while, you got to go to the bathroom. And that's a sign that, the exercise is having an effect on, your bowel habits. All right. And again, we're really good at doing this on our own. It makes sense when you think that human beings have been on Earth for about 500,000 years. If we really needed some external product to help us detox, well, there would be no humans on Earth. So again, myth busted. You don't have to cleanse or detox your colon. So again, total myth. So again, that's the end of that myth. I'll have a new myth every week. Now I want to move on to what I call the meat of the podcast, and that's going to be the genetic causes of rhabdomyolysis. I have not previously talked about this before. Again, I wrote the first book on rhabdomyolysis, exercise-induced rhabdomyolysis ever, which is just called Rhabdo. You can get it on my website, joe-cannon.com, or it's on Amazon as well. But again, I haven't gone into detail on the genetics of Rhabdo, and this actually came about as an email I received from somebody on social media and asked me about this. And I thought, it's a great idea. It's amazing. I just never talked about it at length before. So what I want to do here is cover 5 different genetic traits that can elevate one's risk of getting rhabdomyolysis. Now, again, if you're not familiar with rhabdomyolysis, not a big deal. Real brief overview is rhabdomyolysis. It's a medical condition that refers to muscle fiber breakdown. And when the muscle fibers break down, they release their contents into the bloodstream, and this can cause some really serious things happening, such as, your kidneys may stop working, your liver enzymes get all out of whack, you may have heart problems, your muscles may swell in size, and you may not even be able to bend or extend your arms or legs anymore. Sometimes this can require hospitalization to treat. As a matter of fact, I always do recommend that people who think they have rhabdo go to the hospital. And there have been, unfortunately, cases where people have actually died from rhabdo. Again, it is rare, but it has happened. And again, there are some genetic traits that can elevate one's risk. And I think this is really important to talk about because I don't think it gets the attention it deserves. Fortunately, after 10 years of talking about rhabdomyolysis, it is starting to get attention by the mainstream media, as they sometimes say. And I'm glad to hear that. But I haven't yet heard anybody talking about the genetics of rhabdo and things that can elevate that risk. And I think that's something that needs to be discussed. We need to have that conversation, especially not only for the public at large, but also, I think that parents of athletes, kid athletes, and even PE teachers at middle school, high school, and college level should be thinking about this as well, because they may be, again, right on the front lines where some of their students may have some of these conditions, and knowledge of this can help mitigate how significant this may be and allow them to continue to participate in exercise. So again, hopefully this episode will make itself into the hands or ears of parents and PE teachers and coaches alike, so that this would be a nice refresher for them in case they have any questions, where maybe some student athletes may be coming up with certain conditions, which again may elevate the risk of rhabdo. Now, you may have heard of some of these before. Some of them actually do get attention in the news media. Some of them do not as much as I would like. So here are basically 5 different traits of that can elevate someone's risk of rhabdomyolysis. But again, realize when I go into this episode, I really only want to give you a summary of the conditions, because I know science and genetics can be a little boring at times for some people. And, if you're driving while you're listening, I don't want you falling asleep at the wheel of your car. So what I want to do is I want to give you a summary of the condition and put it in its proper context as it pertains to rhabdomyolysis. So again, let's just get right into it. The first topic that I want to cover is something that I think most people probably have not heard of before, and that's called malignant hyperthermia. Malignant hyperthermia. This is a genetic condition, and as you can kind of an idea from the name hyperthermia, there is a rise in body temperature. And this is a genetic condition which occurs, usually it's seen after somebody is maybe in the hospital and they're getting anesthesia. Anesthesia can actually trigger malignant hyperthermia in people who have the genetic trait for this condition. And again, it is rare, but it is something that may pop up from time to time in people. One of the statistics I saw in this is about 1 out of every 2 to maybe 3,000 people may have this condition. Again, usually it's seen in the hospital, but it could be seen, say, with exercise as well. If you've ever gotten surgery, you may have noticed on some of the forms you fill out, they may even ask you, do you have any problems with anesthesia? Well, one of the reasons why they're probably asking that question is they're trying to screen for people who may be at a greater risk of malignant hyperthermia. And what happens in this condition is, again, you have a very quick rise in body temperature. The body temperature goes very high. That's actually bad. There could be very severe muscle contractions as well. And again, that can also be very serious. So they need to be aware of this, especially during surgery. I know a nurse who ran into his very first case of malignant hyperthermia. And again, he's been a nurse for decades, and he said it was the very first time he's ever seen a case of it. This was actually in a young boy who got it during some routine surgery. Again, very, very rare. He's been, like I said, a nurse for decades, and he'd only seen 1 case of it. But it is something that I do believe everybody should be thinking about, especially if they're having surgery, but also maybe even in the athletic population as well. So how does this malignant hyperthermia occur? What's the genesis of this? How does it actually occur? Well, if you remember back that from maybe biology class that you may have heard of, that calcium, the mineral calcium, is needed for muscle contraction. It helps us contract our muscles. You need it for, basically every muscle in your body. Even your heart needs calcium to contract. And inside your cells of your body, calcium is stored in a little reservoir called, and this is a big word, the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The sarcoplasmic reticulum. That's essentially a little bag of calcium that's in your cells. And again, it sequesters the cell's reservoir of calcium. And when your muscles contract, it releases the calcium and it pumps the calcium back into its reservoir. Well, turns out that some forms of anesthesia can cause calcium to be released from this reservoir at very high rates, and this can cause uncontrolled extreme muscle contraction. And again, with muscle contraction causes heat, and so body temperature tends to go up really high. And you don't want too high body temperature because that can be very, very dangerous for us. So again, relatively rare in the general population, anywhere from say one every 2 or 3,000 people. It's speculated has it. We don't know the true incidence because not everybody is going to be getting genetic testing for malignant hyperthermia. They believe they are. And most people go through their whole lives and they may never have any symptoms of it. So again, that's another reason why we don't know the actual incidence in the general population. Now, again, it is a serious condition, and there have been some people who have unfortunately died from this condition. It is, rare. Over time, medical technology has gotten better, anesthesia has gotten better. So one of the statistics I saw as I was investigating this topic said that it's estimated only about 5% of people with malignant hyperthermia will actually die from it. Again, if you're one of that 5, it is significant. But again, it used to be as high as 80%. So medical technology has gotten better. But again, 5%, again, it's rare, but it's still a lot. I did a little bit of math, and if you do the math, 5% of 2,000 to 3,000, that's 100 to 150 people. So again, that's one is more higher than I would like. So again, this is the reason why I believe they're asking this question about anesthesia when you're getting surgery, because this is probably when I think most people are probably going to find out that they have it or not. Now, again, it's not just surgery that could elicit malignant hyperthermia in individuals. We know that exercise, especially intense exercise in hot environments, can have this condition rear its ugly head. And there's even some reports of malignant hyperthermia occurring in people under lots of emotional stress, such as really bad heated arguments. If they go on long enough in some people, that could trigger this gene. Again, most people this is not going to happen to, but again, there are reports of this occurring in areas that are outside, the hospital setting. And again, there is a link to rhabdomyolysis here because, many people who get rhabdo, they are later found to have the gene for malignant hyperthermia. So again, there is a link by having this condition and also getting rhabdomyolysis. Again, if you're not getting genetic tested for this condition, again, it's kind of hard to tell if you got it until it pops up. So again, it's definitely something that I think people should be aware of. Now, when people, as they get older, maybe sometimes they may be on certain medications that control their cholesterol. Not even older, even younger people are taking these medications. They're most likely, you've probably heard them called statins. Statin medications are cholesterol-lowering drugs. You've seen these things advertised on TV. They've been around a long time. They are very effective at lowering cholesterol levels in people. But I do want you to realize that a potential side effect of statin medications in some individuals could be rhabdomyolysis. So you got the malignant hyperthermia trait, you're taking statins, you're exercising more. Again, there could be that perfect storm which could be elicited through the combined effect of intense exercise, statin medications in that person who has malignant hyperthermia. Again, I can't tell you the rate of people who take statins who get malignant hyperthermia. One report that I saw, again, this comes from 2010, noted that statin use may, quote, may account for as many as 76,000 cases of rhabdomyolysis per year in America alone. Now, again, that's everybody. That I don't know how many of those 76,000 cases are people who have malignant hyperthermia. Again, if we admit that malignant hyperthermia may only be in 1 in every 2,000 to 3,000 people, again, it's a pretty low amount. But again, in the person taking statins, it could elevate the risk to some degree. So how might statin medication increase the risk? Well, again, it comes back to calcium. We know that these statin medications can lower cholesterol levels very effectively, lower bad cholesterol levels very effectively, but they can also increase that release of calcium from its reservoir in the cells. Remember that calcium is needed for muscle contraction, and in the case of statins, they also raise calcium levels. In the person who has malignant hyperthermia, they have an exorbitant release of calcium from its reservoir. So again, the combined effect of both of these might make the rhabdomyolysis effect more apparent. Again, it's just something that I think people should be keeping in the back of their mind. In theory, statins plus malignant hyperthermia, the trait for that plus intense exercise, could make rhabdomyolysis more apparent. So again, that's the summary, the big picture, if you will, of malignant hyperthermia. Again, most people probably not going to experience this condition, but it is something that doesn't get talked about a lot, and I think it's something that we should keep in the back of our minds just in case. While malignant hyperthermia is relatively rare out there, the next thing I want to talk about is something that I think most people have probably heard about when it comes to rhabdomyolysis. This is probably the most well-known thing which could trigger it, and that is the sickle cell anemia trait. The sickle cell anemia trait. Essentially, you have one gene for sickle cell anemia. It takes 2 genes to get that disease. If you only have one gene, you don't have the disease. You don't have sickle cell anemia, rather you just have what's called the sickle cell trait. So again, this is not a disease, it is just a genetic trait. And again, it is associated with an increased risk of rhabdomyolysis. Take a step back. What is sickle cell anemia? Well, essentially the name kind of gives it away what it is. Generally, if you have sickle cell anemia, you don't have a lot of healthy red blood cells. We know that red blood cells carry oxygen through the body. In someone who has sickle cell anemia, their red blood cells don't look normal. Normal red blood cells are they look like little coffee saucers. They're round, if you will, and they go through the blood vessels very easily. Well, with sickle cell anemia, the red blood cells look like little crescent moons, sickles. Like if you ever look up in the sky at night, you'll see a quarter of the moon. The moon has a little curve to it. That's what I mean when I say sickle. It looks like a sickle or a crescent moon. And when the blood cells look like this, they don't carry oxygen very well. They break apart really easily, and they can more easily get stuck inside the blood vessels of the body, especially the small blood vessels. And so when you've got red blood cells that aren't working very well, you get anemia. Anemia is, you don't have a lot of red blood cells. And so again, that's why they call it sickle cell anemia. When these sickle cells, they don't carry a lot of oxygen and they break apart really easily and they get stuck inside blood vessels, well, this can actually restrict oxygen flow to the muscles. And this restriction of oxygen flow to the muscle can cause pain. So people who have sickle cell anemia, they often report having pain. They feel pain in their muscles. Sometimes they even feel pain in their bones as well. So again, that's the sickle cell anemia. But the sickle cell trait is different. Generally, someone who has a sickle cell trait, they only have one gene. Again, remember, it takes 2 genes to make the disease apparent. So these individuals just have one gene for it. So they generally, they're not going to have any symptoms of sickle cell anemia as a rule. Some actually may experience muscle pain, for instance, but that's only under certain conditions, which we'll talk about. And again, I do want to reiterate the sickle cell trait is not a disease. And I think that's important for people to to realize. You can actually make an argument, and sometimes in science books they will bring this up. People who have this sickle cell trait, this is kind of like sickle cell trait trivia, those individuals appear to be more resistant to getting malaria. So, sometimes in genetics class in college, they may even say, well, this is a reason for a positive genetic mutation. These individuals don't get as much malaria. Again, we'll stick a pin in that for a further discussion maybe in the future. But again, I like to point out, especially for the PE teachers and the coaches who have heard of sickle cell trait, which I know most of them most likely have at this point, I want you to realize it's not a disease. It's just a genetic trait that some people do carry. And again, in the U.S., we got about 4 million people in America alone who have this sickle cell anemia trait. And worldwide, it's estimated that as many as 300 million people on Earth actually have this condition. When someone has the sickle cell anemia trait, they may not even have any of the more common symptoms of sickle cell anemia. Some may experience pain under certain conditions, but again, most people may not. They may not have any issues with the condition for most, if not all, of their lives. That said, some things can trigger the sickle cell anemia trait to kick in, and those things, which again are relevant for today's discussion, would be intense exercise or exertion. Doesn't have to be quote-unquote exercise. Intense exertion and also dehydration can also cause the sickle cell trait to become apparent. And again, what's happening during intense exercise, intense exertion, and dehydration is that when you're exercising intensely, there's a higher level of acidity in the blood. We've all heard about lactic acid building up in the blood during exercise. And again, during dehydration, there's lack of oxygen. Again, what happens is sometimes during intense exercise and dehydration, the red blood cells change their shape. They begin to look more sickle-like. And so the sickle cell anemia trait, in this instance, the red blood cells become like they look like sickle cells, and as such, they don't carry oxygen as well, they're more easily damaged, they can break apart more easily, restrict blood flow, etc. So under extreme conditions, the sickle cell anemia trait may actually start to bring about sickle cell anemia symptoms. And that's why it is, I think, important, especially for not only people who have the sickle cell trait to be aware of this, but also, let's say, the PE teachers and the coaches out there who are working with student athletes. Again, many colleges right now actually do genetic testing on all college athletes. One of the things they are testing for is the sickle cell anemia trait. Again, it's something that there have been several reports in the news over the last few years, which I've suspected some of these reports of say, football players, but there have been others who actually have unfortunately died during exercise training camps. I believe some of them may have had the sickle cell anemia trait, and that's why I think this is starting to get more attention, which I'm very glad it is. Now, who might be more likely to have the sickle cell anemia trait? Across the board, researchers will point out there's three main groups. There's African Americans, there's those in the Middle East, and those also from, say, India and the Mediterranean part of the earth. So those three groups tend to have most of these sickle cell anemia trait cases out there. With African Americans, it's estimated that about 8% of African Americans have the sickle cell anemia trait. Again, it's pretty prevalent, and that's why I believe a lot of college athletic departments and universities are doing genetic testing on all athletes. That said, I want to bring up something. If you just listen to me, you said African Americans, you heard me say Middle Eastern, Mediterranean, India, you may have said that, okay, well, that's only people with darker skin have to worry about this. And I would say, no, that's not the case. As I was investigating this topic, I even came across a paper from the 1930s that mentioned that white people can get the sickle cell anemia trait as well. So again, this has been out there for a long time. I don't think the idea that white people can get sickle cell anemia trait is talked about very much, but one of the things that I've seen actually comes from the NCAA. They estimate that 1 out of every 2,000 to 10,000 white people actually do have the sickle cell anemia trait. So again, it's something that I do believe people need to be more aware of. It's just not one group. It's maybe more prevalent in some groups more than other, but technically anybody could be getting this condition. Remember that intense exercise can make the sickle cell anemia trait more apparent. And who does lots of physical activity? The military. So the first recorded case of someone in the military dying and has been attributed to sickle cell anemia trait, that dates back to 1968. So there could be cases that date back even prior to that. But again, 1968 seems to be the watershed moment when it was attributed directly to this condition. There was a study that I found as I was investigating this topic. This was a 3-year study from 1977 to 1981 in people in the military, and these researchers concluded that if they just looked at the African American military recruits, those who had the sickle cell anemia trait were 28 times more likely to unexpectedly die during exercise than those who did not have the trait. 28 times more likely than other African-American military recruits who did not have the trait. And then if they looked at all of the military recruits in America at that time, they found that those with the sickle cell anemia trait were actually 40 times more likely to die during exercise training than those who did not have a trait. So again, this is something that I think we should be paying attention to. Again, very, very serious. The military has been working hard over the decades to try to get people mitigate their symptoms with modified exercise training programs where necessary, and also better equip those who are on the field training our military recruits on how to recognize sickle cell anemia and get people medical attention when they actually need it. Still, however, there's definitely going to be people who, unfortunately, do succumb from the illness. One of the papers that I uncovered, this one came out in 2018. It was titled "Sickle Cell Trait and Sudden Death." These researchers essentially said that sickle cell anemia trait and I'm quoting them here, continues to be the leading cause of death in young African Americans in military basic training and civilian organized sports. And again, I bring that up because I want people to realize this is not something that you're going to see in the Marines and the Navy and the Army, etc. Again, there are people who are in school right now who may be student athletes who may have this condition. Again, this is another reason why I think that I want to do this talk, because I thought that coaches should be better able to hopefully recognize this and help those athletes when they need it. So if we look at the college athletes with the sickle cell anemia trait, the first recorded case of a student athlete dying attributed to this disorder came out in 1973, so quite a few years ago. And it's been estimated that between 1974 and 2010 that there have been at least 18 reported deaths associated with the sickle cell anemia trait. So again, that's not non-significant. That's, again, even one is too much in my book. So again, coaches should definitely be thinking about this with their student athletes. Colleges many times are going to be doing genetic testing, and one of the things they're testing for is the sickle cell anemia trait. If you want to, again, learn more about this, the couple of resources for you, the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, actually has a little PDF book you can download on their website. It came out actually in 2010, so I think I'd like to say a little bit updated, but it's called Screening U.S. College Athletes for Their Sickle Cell Disease Carrier Status. And in the National Collegiate Association, the NCAA, I always butcher that acronym, they actually have a document that people can download called Sickle Cell Trait, a fact sheet for coaches. So you can just search for them online and find it. If you cannot, that's no problem. All these links I'm talking about today are going in the show notes, that if you go over to joe-cannon.com, you go to the podcast section, you search for podcast episode number 13, Genetic Rhabdomyolysis Traits. You scroll to the bottom where the notes are. I'm going to put links to all this stuff there so you can download it and take a look at it for yourself. If I look at that fact sheet for coaches, which I did as I was preparing for this episode, the NCAA recommends all athletic departments confirm sickle cell anemia trait status in all student athletes. So they recommend all student athletes everywhere get tested for the sickle cell anemia trait. And again, a lot of colleges are doing that. They also point out something that I think really needs to be brought to the attention of more people. Again, sickle cell anemia trait is not a disease, it's just a trait, and you do not need to exclude athletes if they have the sickle cell anemia trait. They can still exercise, you just have to modify the exercise program accordingly. And one of the things that the NCAA does recommend is, gradually over time increase the exercise intensity. Don't just throw them in the ocean on the very first day and having them doing wind sprints when they haven't done anything like that before or hadn't done it in a long time, because that's when problems can arise. So slowly increasing exercise intensity is going to go a long way to reducing sickle cell anemia trait being a problem for these student athletes. Again, the NCAA also does report that from 2000 to 2009, at least 7 football athletes in college have died from the sickle cell anemia trait during conditioning activities. And I point that out for a reason, because usually the student athletes have problems during the conditioning training sessions, not during the games, but it's during those pre-season conditioning programs. That's when these athletes seem to be having problems, rather not during in-season. Again, what's causing that? Well, my guess is there's probably multiple things going on here. Maybe you've got athletes who haven't been conditioning themselves prior to the training season. You also may have conditions occurring outside in very hot conditions. Also, maybe the coach is pushing people beyond their physiologic limits too quickly. I think they could all play roles in the sickle cell trait becoming apparent. And again, football, as I've been paying attention to this over the last few years, I've noticed that football seems to get a lot of the publicity when it comes to student athletes, unfortunately, passing away from this condition. I want you to realize it's not just football we're talking about here. There have been instances of sickle cell anemia trait playing roles in the demise of other athletes, such as even track and field athletes. So it's not limited to just one athletic competition sport. It could be apparent in other sports as well. One thing I would point out for the coaches who may be listening to me right now, again, realize that these student athletes who have the sickle cell anemia trait, they may begin to start complaining of fatigue and pain and weakness in their muscles. And these complaints can arise relatively fast, such as 1, 2, 3 minutes into intense training, such as sprinting, for example. Many people who have the sickle cell anemia trait will start complaining of problems within minutes after beginning, again, really difficult exercise. So again, that's one way you may recognize it. But again, if you're at the college level, odds are your college is already doing genetic testing. So you probably are getting feedback on who's got the trait, who doesn't have the trait. So that can actually help you. If you're at maybe the high school level, the middle school level, I don't think they're doing genetic testing on those student athletes. Again, I'd welcome input and feedback from PE teachers who know more about this than I do, but I don't think that middle school students, et cetera, are getting genetic testing, but I could be wrong. The other thing I would point out for the coaches is if you are traveling to other areas of different elevations, different altitudes, realize that can also be a problem for those who have the sickle cell anemia trait. Remember, anemia, lack of oxygen, they're exercising intensely. Well, if as their red blood cells change their shape and become more sickled, remember at higher elevations, there's less oxygen, and this less oxygen can make it much more difficult for people with a sickle cell anemia trait to compete. So again, if you're, say, going from, say, Philadelphia to Colorado, where it's much higher elevation, that would be a problem for those with the trait. So again, they can exercise. We just have to modify their exercise programming accordingly, and with some luck, proper hydration, etc., this should not be a problem for most people. Okay, so that's basically a nice summary of the sickle cell anemia trait. That's the second thing that I wanted to bring out in this episode. The third condition that I want to discuss this week is something that I think most people may have not heard of, and this is a genetic condition. It's usually called McArdle disease, McArdle syndrome, or McArdle's disease. Named after, you guessed it, Dr. McArdle, who first discovered it in 1951. And then basically named it after him. So if you're reading, again, I'm going to put all the links in the show notes so you can check it out for yourself. But as you are reading maybe some of the clinical studies, realize that it also goes by its more technical name, glycogen storage disease type 5. Glycogen storage disease type 5. Again, outside of a laboratory, nobody's calling it that. They call it McArdle's disease or McArdle syndrome. And it impacts about 1 out of every 100,000 people. It has been described as the most common disorder of muscle metabolism out there. I've actually encountered a few people over the years who've actually had this condition, both men and women, although I would point out that for whatever reason, it tends to affect men more than women. More men get McArdle's disease more than women do. What is McArdle syndrome? What is this condition? Let's go back to how we make energy. Let's do a little refresher here. Remember that in order for you to make energy, your body needs sugar, glucose. Glucose is your blood sugar. If you ever had a blood test, your doctor's measuring your blood sugar. And what happens is the sugar enters our cells, and we then use that glucose, that sugar, to make energy. It's called ATP. That's the fancy term for energy in our cells. So when we eat food, the sugar from the food gets into our cells and then enters our blood, where it can go into our cells and make energy. And that's how it normally works. When we eat more sugar than we can use for energy, we store that extra glucose in our muscles and in our liver. And the storage form of glucose is called glycogen. Glycogen is nothing more than just a storage form of glucose. And they're essentially the same thing, they just look different. And the analogy I usually talk about in class I teach is, think of like ice and water. They're the same thing, they look different. When ice melts, it melts back to water. When glycogen melts, it melts back to glucose. So there's the same thing, they just look a little different, and glycogen is just the storage form of glucose in the body. And again, here's the rub here. People who have McArdle syndrome, they have a problem breaking down glycogen. They can store it, but they don't break it down so well. And that's because they're missing a very critical enzyme. And that enzyme is technically called myophosphorylase. Myophosphorylase. I'm giving you this in case it ever comes up on a round of Jeopardy or something like that. But myophosphorylase, myo, M-Y-O, the prefix myo means muscle. So this is technically also called muscle phosphorylase, and it's an enzyme that breaks down glycogen. Well, since people with McArdle's are lacking this enzyme, they don't break down glycogen, and that means that when they're exercising, they have to rely on the sugar that's floating through their bloodstream, and they don't rely so much on the storage form of glucose. So that's an issue because we don't have a lot of glucose floating around our bloodstream at any given moment. So when people with McArdle's begin to exercise, they run out of sugar real fast. And so because of that, they start getting tired really quickly. They fatigue, they cramp really quickly after exercise. How quickly? Within minutes. Within a couple minutes after exercise, they start getting very tired, very fatigued. Their muscles may cramp up, may get stiff. Again, this is going to cause obviously pain. And again, it happens relatively fast after exercise. Again, within a couple minutes, they may experience this. Oddly enough, after say 5 or 10 minutes, they may start to improve exercise-wise. Their endurance may start to improve. And that's technically called the second wind phenomenon. The second wind phenomenon is essentially, their bodies can't use sugar anymore, so the body begins to burn its other energy source, which is fat. And so after about 10 minutes or so, they start getting a little bit better exercise-wise, and their endurance improves, and that's a sign that they're burning more fat and less sugar. Again, they're limited by how much sugar they can break down for energy, and so their body will start burning more fat eventually, but it's going to take some time for that to happen. So, as you probably can guess, there is a relationship between McArdle's and rhabdomyolysis. Many people with McArdle's disease, when they're exercising, they can't, and so this is going to cause muscle damage eventually, and that muscle damage essentially is one of the hallmarks of rhabdomyolysis. As a matter of fact, it's estimated that about half of the people out there, about 50% of people with McArdle's at one time or another, will experience rhabdomyolysis. So again, what's going on here is they're exercising, their muscles are breaking down. This is causing the release of compounds into the muscle, into the blood, and that can cause problems such as, again, most commonly with rhabdo, people have probably heard about kidney failure. Many individuals with rhabdomyolysis may find themselves in the hospital. Some of them will be on dialysis to help protect their kidneys. kidneys. Other side effects of rhabdo could be reddish brownish urine, which again is due to a protein which is released into the blood when the muscles break down, and that changes the color of the urine to looking like iced tea or cola color, reddish brownish color. Again, that usually happens after exercise. So again, that may be something for coaches to be on the lookout for. Again, it's a little hard with younger kids. You're not going to be saying how, what your pee look like, obviously. But again, if anybody ever does say to you, hey, my urine kind of looks like, cola or iced tea or something like that, it's not a good sign. And so that could be a tip off for some coaches. Again, along the same line, since we mentioned statin medications before, again, statins, along with McArdle syndrome, could elevate the risk of rhabdomyolysis. Again, not lots and lots of statistics on this, but again, realize that statins will raise the risk of rhabdo. McArdles will raise the risk of rhabdomyolysis. So too will exercise. Again, so when you combine them together, theoretically, the risk of rhabdo becomes more likely. How likely, I can't tell you, I've not seen statistics on McArdles and exercise and statin medications, but again, I have encountered people over the years, not a lot of them, who have told me that they've got rhabdo after they started a statin. They never had a problem with McArdles, but again, it became more apparent if they did a statin. So something to keep in the back of your mind. Again, not just exercise. Like we saw before, emotional stress, really bad arguments, protracted heated arguments, and some individuals have also caused McArdle syndrome to become an issue. So again, while we normally hear about McArdles and exercise, again, even emotional stress in some people can trigger this. I mentioned kids a bit ago because this is probably not something I think most kids are getting tested for. And again, if you are a gym teacher, PE teacher, and you're working with middle school kids or something like that, I would point you to the McArdle's disease website. That's mcardlesdisease.org, and they do have some tools that coaches can use to maybe screen, kind of, if you can sort of say that, on the field for kids who may have this. For instance, one of the things that they will mention is if the kid looks healthy, but that kid is really, really out of shape, has trouble, gets out of breath really easily, walking up steps, or even with low intensity exercise, and it's really difficult for them to improve their aerobic exercise ability, that could be a sign of McArdles. Again, they look like they're in shape, but they're getting out of breath really easily, and it's really difficult for them to improve their, say, walking ability, running ability, and stuff like that. They're, you're a PE coach, you have running laps around on the track or something like that, and they can't do it, but they look like they should be able to do it. Again, might be a tip-off from McArdles. Again, rule of thumb, anybody who says their urine looks really dark-colored, like, iced tea or something like that, that's not a good sign. That's a classic case, a classic sign, if you will, of rhabdo. That doesn't happen in everybody, but that dark-colored urine symptom does get a lot of attention. I do like to know I'd like people to realize it doesn't happen in everybody, but generally speaking, if your urine looking like iced tea, that's not a good sign. Jump back to episode number 7, I believe. That's where I covered a lot of rhabdomyolysis myths, and this is one of the myths that I addressed in that episode. So go back to episode number 7, and we'll cover much more about rhabdomyolysis and the myths and the facts about that condition. Now, I also like people to realize that if someone has McArdle syndrome, they can exercise and they can improve where their exercise ability is. It's just going to take time. Again, this is not a hurdle that is insurmountable. I have met people who have McArdles and they exercise. Matter of fact, I've actually even met personal fitness trainers who have had McArdle's syndrome, and they are personal trainers. They work out. They just need to listen to their body and progress their bodies a little slowly. But again, exercise is possible, and I think it's a very empowering thing for people to hear, and I want to say that because I don't think it gets said enough. But McArdles, this is something that you may or may not have heard of. It's, again, very, very, very much out there that people have probably heard about it to a degree. I don't think it gets talked about that much, and it is essentially an enzyme deficiency syndrome. I also want you to realize that McArdles is not the only enzyme deficiency syndrome out there that could elevate the risk of rhabdo. There are several others out there. I'm not going to cover them all in depth like I just did with McArdle's, but 4 others which are out there. There's an enzyme deficiency syndrome, which is called phosphofructokinase. Phosphofructokinase, that's PFK. If you've ever taken a class in cell biology, you quickly learn the importance of PFK. It's a very important enzyme in the energy generating pathway of our bodies. But that is one enzyme deficiency that could raise the risk of rhabdomyolysis occurring. 3 others would be phosphorylase kinase deficiency, phosphorylase kinase. Another one is phosphoglyceric mutase deficiency, phosphoglyceric mutase deficiency, and also lactate dehydrogenase deficiency, lactate dehydrogenase. Again, I give you these just in case you're doing your own research. And again, it's McArdle's being probably the most well-known out there, but these other enzyme deficiency issues could also raise the risk of rhabdo. So just for your own notes, if you're taking notes, hopefully not while you're driving, I want you to realize there's other things out there that can cause it. Let's now leave McArdle's alone. Let's talk about the 4th genetic condition, which could elevate the risk of rhabdo occurring, and that's a condition called Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. What is this? Well, dystrophy, the word dystrophy is a medical term. It refers to the breakdown or wasting of an organ or tissue, all right? And since here we're talking muscular dystrophy, this is a wasting disease of the muscles. And again, just for trivia, I like useless information. Just for trivia's sake, it's called Duchenne's muscular dystrophy because it was discovered first by a French neurologist named Dr. Duchenne in the 1860s. You've probably heard of muscular dystrophy, but again, I bring this up, Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, because it's one type of muscular dystrophy. There's actually about 9 different types out there, Duchenne muscular dystrophy being just one of those types. When I went to the Muscular Dystrophy Association website, which is a fine website if you're looking for more information on this, they basically call Duchenne's muscular dystrophy a genetic disorder characterized by muscle degradation and weakness due to a lack of a protein. And the protein is called dystrophin. Dystrophin. What does dystrophin do? Dystrophin helps keep our muscles intact. It helps maintain the structural integrity of our muscle fibers. And if you're lacking this dystrophin protein, well, it could lead to the muscles being more easily broken down, more fragile, more easily damaged, which again, what is rhabdomyolysis? A breakdown of the muscle tissue, muscle fibers break down. So it makes sense if you don't have this dystrophin protein, this could elevate the risk of rhabdomyolysis occurring. Now, in terms of prevalence out there, the research I noted was that in both America and North America and Europe, the prevalence is about 6 people per 100,000 individuals, 6 people per 100,000 individuals. So that's not a lot, but again, it is worth noting that it is a medical condition that could raise the risk of rhabdomyolysis. So again, I wanted to bring this up, even though it's not probably the most prevalent condition out there. Also, interestingly, some of the reports of rhabdomyolysis I've seen, which related to Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, noted that this became more prevalent when they were getting anesthesia. Remember, we talked about anesthesia and malignant hyperthermia. Well, perhaps maybe people who have muscular dystrophy, they may also have a issue with anesthesia as well. Perhaps maybe muscular dystrophy plus anesthesia raises the risk of rhabdo as well. Again, just something to keep in the back of your mind for those who may be dealing with this disorder. Again, it's relatively rare out there, maybe 6 per 100,000 people. It is something that I think we should be talking about more. One of the papers that I did uncover as I was researching this topic, the end of the paper went like this. The association between rhabdomyolysis and muscular dystrophies is under-recognized in clinical practice. Again, basically they're saying this may not be on the radar of some medical professionals. And so again, another reason why I think this is a conversation worth having. So again, that's Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. Again, any kind of muscular dystrophy theoretically could raise the risk of rhabdomyolysis. But I want to end the discussion of muscular dystrophy with that. And I want to move on to the 5th and final topic for today, which is basically it's called carnitine deficiency. Carnitine deficiency. Carnitine, I always basically call it a taxi cab molecule. Carnitine basically transports fatty acids, fats, to the mitochondria, where we can break down those fats and turn them into energy. Now, the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. That's where we make energy and we burn fat. I like to call them batteries because that's essentially what they are. They're fat-burning batteries. And in order for the batteries to work, they got to have carnitine. If you jump back to episode number 8, I talked about a supplement which is touted to make your mitochondria work better, which you might be interested in. You may have heard about that particular product, but that's again, that's episode number 8. But the mitochondria and the carnitine molecule, they kind of go hand in hand. They need each other to work. Turns out that we get carnitine. Okay, we make it actually in the body, but we also get it from food. We get it from milk. It's in chicken. It's in fish. It's in hamburger. So this is something that we normally don't have a problem getting into our body, but sometimes people with carnitine deficiency syndrome, either they don't make it or they don't absorb it very well. And if that does happen, then carnitine deficiency can elevate the risk of exercise-induced rhabdomyolysis. So again, it's a topic that I don't think this is on a lot of people's radar, but I think it's something that people should be considering. Now, along the same lines, when I first introduced carnitine, some of you may have said to me, Joe, isn't that a dietary supplement? Yes, it is. You can get carnitine at health food stores and supermarkets and stuff like that. And so you may be asking yourselves, well, if someone has Rhabdo, would carnitine supplements help their Rhabdo? What I can say is I looked into this, and I'm going to look more into this. What I have seen so far is that there are some preliminary, and by preliminary I mean laboratory animal research, rats and mice, suggesting that carnitine supplements may help mitigate the symptoms of Rhabdo in those animals. I have also seen anecdotal reports online from humans who have said that when they took carnitine, their Rhabdo symptoms seemed to feel better. They weren't as fatigued, for instance. The problem, however, is I cannot find any real clinical studies where they took people with Rhabdo and they gave them carnitine or a placebo to see what would happen. So I don't know if it would help or not. I think if carnitine supplements do help Rhabdo, I think it may be more likely to occur in somebody who has carnitine deficiency syndrome. It may not work in people who have other genetic traits, genetic linkages to Rhabdo. Again, to know for sure, it's going to take some clinical research, and I don't know right now if it's going to work or not, but I am going to do some more research on this because I was intrigued when I first saw it. I had never seen anything on carnitine helping Rhabdo before, so I'm probably going to write a blog post on this on my website, so when it does, I'll let you know when that comes out. But hopefully this helped you better understand the genetics of Rhabdo. Again, just to recap what we talked about in this episode, we talked about malignant hyperthermia, sickle cell anemia trait, McArdle's disease, which is an enzyme deficiency syndrome, as well as briefly I mentioned phosphofructokinase deficiency, phosphorylase kinase, phosphoglycerate mutase deficiency, and also lactate dehydrogenase deficiency. Other enzymes involved in energy production could cause Rhabdo, as well as Duchenne's muscular dystrophy and carnitine deficiency. Again, there's probably other things out there that can elevate someone's risk of getting rhabdomyolysis. These, I think, are some of the more common and not so common things that I think people should be thinking about, especially those who are exercising. Again, hopefully PE teachers and coaches can listen to this and hopefully that'll help them help their student athletes better. Now, again, as always, the notes for this episode I'm going to be putting at joe-cannon.com, which is going to include all of the links to what I looked at as I was developing this episode. So definitely utilize that for further information. I always do that as well. And also, if you're looking for more information on carnitine, I've got reviews of carnitine in different supplements at my other website, supplementclarity.com. So you can check that out as well. Just a little search box, just search for carnitine, and all the products that include it will probably pop up. Now, that'll end this episode. So what I'll do is I just always like to end these episodes with the quote of the week, kind of send people off with something interesting and hopefully good to get their day started. And the quote of the week for this week is, "The only person you are destined to become is the person you decide to be." Ralph Waldo Emerson. Until next time, gang, I'm Joe Cannon. Go out and make a difference.